Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk about some Arthurian retellings that are on my TBR. So I have been talking about almost as long as I've had this channel about wanting to record a video that is a reader's guide to Arthurian legend. And I have been dragging my feet on that a little bit for a couple of different reasons. Some of which require lengthier explanations than others. But I have decided that it is time for me to do that video. And so while I have been reading and kind of sketching out some notes about how exactly I would like to pull that together, how I would like to recommend things, what kinds of books I'm going to put on there, it has really put me in an Arthurian kind of mood. I always am up for reading Arthurian retellings. I love them. They were one of the steps on my road to becoming a fantasy nerd. They were my favorite thing to read when I was younger, and I have read a lot of them. I've read a lot of the classics, I've read some lesser known ones, but there are always more to read. This is a subject that never gets old in terms of like book retellings or other forms of media. There's always something Arthurian in nature to explore and to enjoy. And there are a few books that are definitely higher at the top of my Arthurian TBR than others. I put together a list of 6 as I was going through my Goodreads, my want to read pile, books that I've kind of had on my radar. And I put together a list of 6 of the Arthurian retellings that are at the top of my personal TBR. And I will start with one that has been talked about, I think, in book hauls on the channel before, and that is Lancelot by Giles Christian. So this is a book that I think people have heard of on BookTube because I know that Elliot Brooks has read it and I know that Petrick has read it and they both really enjoyed it. So I don't think that this one is as much of kind of like an underground novel because it was published a little more recently. There's been some pretty popular booktubers who have talked about it, but this is one that I did not know about until I came over to BookTube. So this is just one that for some reason had slipped under my radar. I have never read it, but I really would like to. This is a book, obviously, that focuses on Lancelot. And I do like when these retellings focus on other characters. I mean, we've had so many permutations of the Arthurian legend. There's so many retellings. It's been tackled from so many angles. And it's fun to follow the story through the eyes of one of the side characters. It's going to be particularly interesting to read this book about Lancelot because I recently, so late summer and early fall of 2021, read Bernard Cornwell's Warlord Chronicles, and in that retelling, Lancelot is just the worst. He is vile, he is arrogant, he is narcissistic, and he will make you so frustrated. And I think it's going to be a really interesting contrast to read this retelling, which focuses on Lancelot presumably as the protagonist of the story, not as a complete antagonist as he was in the Warlord Chronicles. So what I have heard about this one is that it is a very dreamy atmosphere, that the writing is very beautiful, that it's something that you need to take your time and kind of read through. I was chatting to Petrick about it and he assured me that I will really love it. He thinks that it is the type of book that I will really enjoy. So I'm really looking forward to reading it. I think that he has a pretty good gauge on my reading tastes and I am super, super pumped. So this is definitely the highest one on the list. It's just finding a place to put it in. I totally overloaded myself in January and February, so hopefully in kind of March, April, May, I will find a place to be able to start reading this one. Another book that makes this TBR for me is one that I heard of through BookTube, and that was through Yolene's channel over at Yolene Reads, and the book is The Lost Queen by Signe Pike. So this is a work of historical fantasy, and it follows the historical figure who is the sister of the person that Merlin was modeled from. I really am not sure how much of this is actually historically accurate and how much of it is just an imagining on the author's part of the sister of Merlin, but I love Merlin. Merlin is my favorite character in Arthurian legend, which makes sense because if you're a fantasy fan, like the wizard is clearly going to appeal to you. But I also really love Mary Stewart's Arthurian books, and those are focused on Merlin. So I think I just have a lot of love for Merlin, and reading a work of historical fantasy that follows his sister will be very interesting. I really like sibling stories. I love female-centric historical fantasy. This just seems like a lot of the things that I would really like. I'm expecting something that might be a little bit slower in pace, but hopefully has really beautiful writing. I know that Yolene really liked it, and so I feel confident that I will like it as well. And that one is also pretty high up in terms of priority for this Arthurian TBR. Now I need to look at my card because the other ones are ones that I don't think about as often. But number 3, I would like to read the middle grade series, The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper. So this is an older work of children's lit, was published, I think, in the late 60s into the early 70s was the span of time. I believe there are 6 books, but it might be 5. And the series is called The Dark is Rising, which is also the title of the second book. But these are, I think, an amalgamation of various parts of Celtic folklore, Welsh folklore, and then I think there is some heavy emphasis on the Arthurian legend as well. I think for a lot of people who love Arthurian retellings, this is a book that they really enjoyed in their childhood, but I didn't read a lot of kids lit as a kid. And so I never got around to reading these books, but I would really like to give them a try. I don't know if they're appropriate to read with kids who are my kids' age yet, so I will probably get the first couple and just read them myself. I expect that they're very short, considering that they're, aimed at the middle grade audience. But I've heard really great things. I don't know if that's nostalgia for, the stories you loved in your childhood, but I have read some both middle grade and young adult Arthurian retellings, and I would like to see where this one fits in terms of my personal taste, because it is a classic in the kind of middle grade / YA Arthurian genre, I guess, if we're going to call it that. Number 4 is called The Winter Prince by Elizabeth Wein. So this is, or Elizabeth Wine, I guess. I'm not really sure. I apologize. But this is a book that is focused on the character of Mordred. And I said, when I was talking about Lancelot, I am always fascinated at following different characters. There's lots of retellings that follow Morgana or Morgan Le Fay. There are lots that follow Guinevere. There are a few that follow along with Lancelot. But I have never read a retelling that follows Mordred. I have read retellings that kind of flip the traditional, the traditional personality of Mordred, that kind of flips that on its head a little bit, that explores a little bit more of his role and, how he factors into the myth and looks at that in a slightly different way or through a slightly different lens. But I have not read a book that focuses on him as the protagonist. Like, I have not followed him through an entire story. And that alone was enough to put this one on my radar. I think this one was marked as to read in my Goodreads a couple of years ago, and I think that I may have found it on like some sort of list about Arthurian retellings that I had read sometime in the past. But like I said, it's always interesting to look at these books through another character's eyes. And Mordred's got to be a good character to follow. I mean, there are not many Arthurian retellings where he is painted in a positive light. There are a couple that I can think of, definitely more YA focused ones mostly, but it's going to be interesting. I'm looking forward to it, and I really want to know where I'm going to fall in terms of this one. Number 5 is The Road to Avalon by Joan Wolfe. I believe, and I haven't really, I haven't read through and memorized all of these summaries because these are books that I just, like I said, kind of marked as to read a while ago. But I believe this might be a more romance-focused historical fiction. I'm not even sure if this one is fantasy-based, but the way that I saw it pitched, I think, in the little blurb that I read was an Arthurian retelling where everybody is a good person. So it's just, it just follows the relationships between these people, how they relate to one another. Excuse me. Like I said, I think this might have a heavier romance element. There's always some romance in terms of the Arthurian retellings, and especially like tragic romance, but I think this one might just be a more romance-centric book. I don't know that much about it, to be honest, but it looked interesting when I was reading through all of the different books that I have not yet tried, and so I decided to add it to the list. The last one is The Search for King Arthur by David Day. So this is David Day of kind of Tolkien fame. He is a Tolkien scholar. He wrote the Tolkien Bestiary, which is like the animal guide to Tolkien's world, essentially. It's a book that I used to read all the time when I was young. My dad has a copy and I would read it all the time. I have read through it so many times, but it's an illustrated book about Tolkien. So he has written or kind of edited or co-edited a lot of books, retellings. He's written introductions for a lot of Tolkien stuff. But apparently he also has this book that kind of chronicles the way that Arthurian legend and myth has changed through time. I do have a book like that, and I'll just grab it. Ugh. So I do have this Oxford Guide to Arthurian Literature and Legend that I read, I don't know, like maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I think. But I would like to read, you know, it's fun to read nonfiction about the building of a legend sometime, just to understand, like, when did certain characters come into the story? Like the character of Lancelot came into the myth at a much later time than some of the other characters. Which characters have been more lost to time, who feature very heavily in stories like Gawain and the Green Knight, but you don't see them often in more modern retellings of Arthurian legend. There's been a lot of evolution of this legend, the way that we look at it, the lens through which we deconstruct the themes, and you know, all of that changes as we change and as our society changes. So I think it's interesting to read those more academic works sometimes as well. You know, obviously this is not going to be like those kinds of books are not going to be for everyone. And definitely when I go recommending books about King Arthur, that probably wouldn't make the top of the list. But if you're a huge nerd and you like to read about how stories evolve over time, then sometimes reading books like that can be really helpful. And I do enjoy doing that every once in a while. So I will put David Day's book on this TBR as well, because I would like to see what he has to say on the subject. But those are kind of my top 6 priority Arthurian retellings. You know, there's more that are coming out all the time. So if one happens to catch my eye, then I'm sure I will give it a try. I will put it on the TBR. But I would love to hear from you. What are your favorite Arthurian retellings? Are there any in particular that you would really like to read? Hopefully the Warlord Chronicles, because hopefully I convinced you to read that when I did my series review of it, because it's great. But if there's anything Arthur inspired that is on your TBR, I would love to know about it. If you have a favorite Arthurian retelling, please let me know what it is, because if I haven't read it, then I will definitely add it to the list. Like I said, I have started to put together my notes for the Reader's Guide to Arthurian Legend, and hopefully I will have that out and for you guys before too long. But thank you for listening, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye!